Welcome to West Film, where every movie has a story worth telling. From heart-pounding action to twisty mysteries and dramas that stick with you, we dig into the plot, the characters, and the moments that make each film worth your time. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's jump into today's movie. This is West Film. Your story starts here. Out for Justice. A look back at Steven Seagal's Brooklyn revenge thriller. The film did tremendous business at the box office and cemented Steven Seagal's rise as an action star. As Mason Storm, a determined cop who survives an assassination attempt and sets out to make things right, Seagal only deepened his reputation as a nearly indestructible hero. Audiences loved the mix of martial arts, procedural detective work, and revenge-fueled storytelling. That same year brought another hit, Marked for Death, which broadened Seagal's appeal even further by weaving Caribbean culture and supernatural elements into the action. With 3 hits behind him in quick succession, Seagal had become one of Hollywood's most bankable new stars heading into the 1990s. His 4th starring role, in Out for Justice, may well be his most personal performance of that era. His character this time, Detective Gino Felino, stands apart from Seagal's earlier roles because of how deeply tied he is to his own neighborhood and the people in it. Instead of chasing international terrorists or unraveling secret conspiracies, Gino is driven by something much closer to home, the murder of his childhood friend, Bobby Lupo. That personal stake lets Seagal show more raw anger and emotional investment than he had in previous films. He still carries his trademark cool during confrontations, but flashes of real grief and frustration bleed through underneath. Seagal also produced the film, which gave him real say over its creative direction. Everything from the fight choreography to the pacing and overall tone. Much of the hand-to-hand combat draws on Aikido, favoring joint locks, throws, and quick disarms over drawn-out punch-ups. That style became one of the hallmarks of his early films, setting him apart from the explosive, gun-heavy action that dominated the genre at the time. The villain who nearly stole the show, William Forsythe, plays the film's antagonist, Richie Madano, and his performance remains one of the most talked-about elements of Out for Justice. Before this role, Forsythe had already built a solid reputation as a character actor, not a leading man, but someone who specialized in playing volatile, unpredictable, dangerous people. His rough-edged look, expressive face, and knack for swinging between charm and menace made him a natural fit for criminal roles. By the time he signed on, Forsythe already had a strong R.A. copyright, some A. copyright, including Once Upon a Time in America, Raising Arizona, Dick Tracy, and various television work. Directors liked that he could make a character feel genuinely unstable rather than just villainous for villainy sake. As Richie, many consider this the finest performance of his early career. Richie isn't a calculating mastermind, he's impulsive, reckless, and frightening precisely because you can't predict what he'll do next. He kills Bobby Lupo in broad daylight without a second thought and spends the rest of the movie unraveling further into violence. Forsythe resists the urge to play him as a stock action villain. Instead, Richie comes across as someone whose sheer instability makes every scene he's in feel dangerous. His thick Brooklyn accent, unsettling laugh, sudden flashes of rage, and imposing presence all make the character feel unnervingly real. Even in his quieter moments, you sense violence could erupt at any second. That unpredictability keeps tension high and makes every clash between Richie and Gino feel charged. Fans often rank Richie Madano among the best villains in any Seagal film, not because he's a tough fighter, but because his chaos and utter disregard for consequences make him such a dangerous match. Without Forsythe's performance, this would likely have been a far more forgettable revenge story, a film born into a crowded genre. When Out for Justice hit theaters in 1991, It landed in one of the most competitive stretches in action film history. The late 80s and early 90s were defined by stars whose personas were often as big a draw as the movies themselves. Arnold Schwarzenegger meant raw power. Sylvester Stallone stood for grit and perseverance. Bruce Willis brought sarcasm and vulnerability. Jean-Claude Van Damme showed off acrobatic martial arts. Seagal offered something else entirely: a calm, almost unshakable intensity, and Out for Justice sharpened that identity, helping him stand out in a packed field. The film never reached the cultural heights of Terminator 2, Die Hard, or Lethal Weapon, but its reputation grew steadily through home video, cable reruns, and repeat viewings. Over time it became one of those movies fans returned to again and again, introducing new viewers to its gritty world and unforgettable characters. Today it's remembered as one of the defining urban revenge thrillers of the early 90s and one of Seagal's most respected performances. One of its biggest strengths is how it portrays Brooklyn, rather than glossy skylines and tourist landmarks. The film zeroes in on ordinary neighborhood life, corner stores, family ties, and the unspoken rules that hold tight-knit communities together. It feels authentic because everyone knows everyone. Cops grew up alongside criminals, families go back generations, and personal history is tangled up with professional duty. Audiences of the era were already drawn to stories about organized crime and Italian-American neighborhoods. Goodfellas, released just a year earlier, proved there was an appetite for grounded stories about loyalty and betrayal. Out for Justice isn't a gangster epic, but it borrows from that tradition, showing a neighborhood where crime and everyday life exist side by side. The film also tapped into real anxieties of the time. Crime, drug trafficking, gang violence, and urban decay were constant headlines, and news coverage of murders and police corruption was everywhere. Against that backdrop, audiences found comfort watching a fictional cop who acted with total moral clarity and got results. Gino Felino represents a kind of wish fulfillment, a swift justice at a moment when many people saw the real system as sluggish and ineffective. Unlike TV cops wrestling with gray areas, Gino's mission is simple from the start. His lifelong friend was murdered, and the man responsible has to be stopped before anyone else dies. That clarity appeals to viewers looking for pure escapism. The film never asks you to feel for Richie or question whether Gino is in the right. It draws a hard line between good and evil and lets the audience root fully for the hero. Another reason the film has stuck with people is its unusually raw violence. Plenty of 80s action movies celebrated huge body counts without making violence feel disturbing. Out for Justice takes the opposite approach. Richie kills Bobby in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, with real cruelty, instantly marking him as irredeemable and giving the story genuine emotional weight. Violence throughout stays personal rather than anonymous. Victims are neighbors, relatives, old friends. That grounding sets the film apart from movies that lean purely on spectacle. Forsythe's Richie Madano has become one of the film's most lasting contributions to the genre. Decades later, he still turns up on lists of great action movie villains, not for elaborate schemes or physical dominance, but purely for how unhinged he is. Where calculated masterminds plan every move, Richie is a live wire who could go off at any second. And that realism helped shape how later crime films wrote unstable antagonists who rely on psychological menace rather than grand plots. The movie also reinforced Seagal's signature fighting style in pop culture. Before he arrived in Hollywood, most martial arts stars leaned on kicks and flashy choreography. Bruce Lee's speed and precision, Chuck Norris's karate, Van Damme's flexibility and spinning kicks. Seagal introduced audiences to Aikido-based combat built around balance, leverage, and efficient joint manipulation. Behind the camera, every memorable action film has a production story worth telling, and Out for Justice is no exception. Released in 1991, what looks like a straightforward revenge thriller was actually the product of veteran filmmakers demanding location shoots, and Seagal's growing creative control over his own projects. By this point he'd already become one of Warner Brothers' most reliably profitable stars, and each hit gave him more say over how his films got made. Out for Justice reflects that shift, a part studio picture, part passion project shaped heavily by its lead. Director John Flynn built his career on realistic crime dramas rather than big Hollywood spectacle, earning respect through the 70s and 80s for stories grounded in believable characters and authentic settings. His earlier film Rolling Thunder, a revenge thriller starring James Woods and William Devane, was praised for its emotional intensity, a proof of Flynn's knack for blending action with real human drama, which made him a natural fit for this project. Rather than chase flashy visual tricks, Flynn favored a restrained style that let performances carry scenes without a lot of unnecessary cutting. That approach suited Out for Justice perfectly, since its tension comes less from explosions and more from the dangerous people at its center. Flynn was determined to capture a Brooklyn that felt lived in rather than romanticized. So much of the shoot took place on real streets instead of studio sets. That choice paid off. Audiences see actual residential blocks, bars, storefronts, and intersections instead of polished Hollywood constructions, aging buildings, and all those imperfect details help sell the idea that Gino genuinely belongs to this world. Shooting on location wasn't easy, though. Closing streets, managing traffic and crowds, and coordinating action scenes in active neighborhoods took serious planning, especially once word got out that Seagal was filming nearby and locals started showing up to watch. Seagal came into this project at the peak of his early popularity. After the success of Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Marked for Death, Warner Brothers saw him as one of their fastest rising stars, and his box office track record gave him more input than usual, particularly over fight choreography and how his character was portrayed. Unlike actors who simply execute a stunt coordinator's plan, Seagal actively shaped his own combat scenes, drawing on decades of Aikido training to make sure every fight reflected the martial arts' actual philosophy rather than a typical movie brawl. His focus on balance, leverage, and efficient movement became a defining trait of the film's action. Stunt performers later noted that working with Seagal required a different approach than with other action stars. His choreography leaned on wrist locks, arm breaks, throws, and disarms rather than long strings of punches and kicks. Because the timing had to be precise, the cast rehearsed extensively to keep things both realistic and safe. The fights look effortless on screen, but that took a lot of preparation. Every throw was practiced repeatedly so performers knew exactly how to land, and padding was hidden under clothing wherever possible. Camera angles were chosen to sell the impact without adding real risk. Flynn also avoided the rapid cut style common in action films of the era, often letting fight scenes play out in wider shots that show Seagal's actual technique. That choice set the film apart from its competitors and gave audiences a real appreciation for the physical skill on display. Just as crucial to the film's success was casting. William Forsythe as Richie. Flynn understood the story needed a villain who could bring genuine psychological unpredictability rather than someone simply bigger or more physically intimidating than Seagal. The story Out for Justice tells a deceptively simple story, but underneath its straightforward revenge plot is a tightly built crime thriller centered on personal history, emotional stakes, and mounting tension. Rather than sprawling conspiracies or globe-trotting adventure, it stays rooted in the streets of Brooklyn, where every character's connections run deep. That focus pulls the audience in, not just for the action, but for the emotional fallout of every choice made along the way. The film moves as both a police investigation and a personal mission, blending crime drama and martial arts action at a relentless pace from start to finish. It opens by establishing its world right away, a neighborhood where families have known each other for generations, where cops, residents, business owners, and criminals all share the same streets, and where personal and professional lives constantly intersect. That setup matters because it explains why what happens next hits Gino so hard. Unlike action heroes handed a random case, he's dealing with people he's known since childhood, so every confrontation carries years of history behind it. The inciting incident lands almost immediately in one of the film's most shocking scenes. Bobby Lupo, a fellow officer and Gino's lifelong friend, is gunned down in broad daylight by Richie Madano. It isn't the product of some elaborate criminal plot, it's an impulsive act by a man who's completely lost control. Richie shoots Bobby repeatedly in front of horrified witnesses, instantly establishing himself as a threat to everyone around him, not just law enforcement. That opening does a lot of narrative work at once. It creates immediate emotional stakes by killing off a sympathetic character before the story has even settled in. It defines Richie's character without a single speech, and it gives Gino an objective he can't ignore. From here on, the film becomes a relentless pursuit fueled by friendship, loyalty, and duty. After Bobby's death, the story shifts into investigation mode, though unlike a traditional mystery, there's no question of who did it. Everyone knows Richie is the killer. The real tension is whether Gino can find him before anyone else dies, which turns the film from whodunit into pure suspense. Gino combs the neighborhood, questioning old acquaintances and following every lead, and because he grew up there, the investigation feels organic rather than procedural. He knows which bars the criminals frequent and which family members might talk. These scenes build out the world naturally while reinforcing just how tied Gino is to his community. The script smartly cuts between Gino's search and Richie's unraveling behavior, letting the audience track both hunter and hunted rather than losing sight of the villain after the opening murder. Richie stays present throughout, sinking further into paranoia and violence with every scene, which raises the stakes of Gino's mission. As the story goes on, the pacing is one of the film's real strengths. Instead of jumping from one action beat straight to the next, the screenplay balance is quieter, character-driven scenes, conversations in bars, apartments, and local businesses, with sudden bursts of violence. Those slower stretches let tension build naturally before it's released in the next confrontation. Along the way, we learn more about the shared history between Gino and Richie. They came up in the same neighborhood, knew the same people, and understood the same unwritten rules, which makes their conflict feel more complicated than a stranger invading Gino's turf. Part of the tragedy is watching Richie destroy the very community that shaped him. As the film progresses, more victims pile up and Richie's violence escalates. Rather than protecting the people close to him, he becomes a danger to friends, relatives, and associates alike, reinforcing the idea that unchecked violence eventually consumes everything around it. Meanwhile, Gino's pursuit becomes less about the badge and more personal, driven by grief and loyalty as much as duty. Importantly, the script never frames him as chasing revenge for selfish reasons. His mission is about restoring order to a community that Richie has shattered. Throughout, Gino relies on street smarts, observation, and personal relationships rather than forensic tech or digital surveillance, which gives the investigation an authentic, pre-digital feel grounded in human interaction. Themes: justice, loyalty, and community on its surface. Out for Justice is a straightforward story about a cop hunting down his best friend's killer, and its fights and gunplay can easily overshadow what's going on underneath. But there's a surprisingly thoughtful exploration of loyalty, justice, family, violence, and the fragile line between order and chaos running through it. Flynn never spells these ideas out through speeches, they emerge naturally from character and setting, which keeps the film grounded in its identity as a gritty crime thriller even while it explores something deeper. The most central theme is the meaning of justice itself. The title tells you right away this isn't purely a revenge story. Gino wants Richie to pay, sure, but his motivation goes beyond personal anger. He's acting as both a grieving friend and a cop trying to restore peace to a broken neighborhood. That distinction between justice and revenge becomes more important as the story unfolds. Revenge is driven by emotion and seeks satisfaction through suffering, while justice tries to restore balance after a wrong has been done. Gino lets his emotions surface at times, especially when he thinks of Bobby or sees the damage Richie leaves in his wake, but he never abandons his principles. Even in the most dangerous moments, he's focused on stopping further harm rather than satisfying personal hatred. Richie represents the opposite extreme, a man with no real moral boundaries, acting purely on impulse and treating life as disposable. That contrast lets the film examine what happens to a community when justice disappears and chaos takes its place. Closely tied to that is loyalty. Nearly every meaningful relationship in the film runs on it. Gino's determination comes directly from his bond with Bobby, a friendship stretching back to childhood, which makes Bobby's murder feel like the loss of a lifelong connection rather than just a colleague's death. That reflects the tight-knit Brooklyn the film portrays, where families are interconnected across generations and relationships create obligations beyond any legal duty. Gino doesn't chase Richie because it's his job. He does it because loyalty demands it. The film also shows how loyalty can curdle the people around Richie stick close out of fear rather than respect, and as his behavior spirals, those fragile bonds start to crumble. Friends pull away, associates lose faith, even his own family can no longer defend him. It's a clear illustration that real loyalty is built on trust and shared values, while loyalty built on fear eventually collapses. Community and belonging matter just as much. Unlike a lot of action films focused purely on a lone hero, this one keeps reminding viewers that its characters are part of something larger. Brooklyn practically functions as its own character, with every street and storefront carrying emotional weight because generations of people have lived there. Bobby's murder doesn't just affect Gino, it ripples through the entire neighborhood, as families mourn together and everyone senses that something fundamental has shifted. Violence here never stays contained, it spreads through relationships and leaves scars well beyond its immediate victims, which gives Gino's mission real emotional stakes. He isn't defending an abstract idea, he's protecting home. Family shows up in multiple forms throughout the story. Blood relatives matter, but so does chosen family. Bobby is family to Gino in every way that counts, despite there being no blood relation. Richie's relationship with his own family offers a pointed contrast. Instead of protecting them, he drags them into the chaos he creates, and their fear shows how violence within a family can erode trust and safety. The film ultimately suggests that family is defined less by genetics and more by responsibility. People who look out for others strengthen their communities, while those acting purely out of self-interest end up destroying themselves and everyone around them. And running through all of it is a serious treatment of violence itself. Every act of brutality here creates more suffering. Bobby's death sets off grief, fear, and further bloodshed, and Richie's total lack of self-control fuels a cycle that eventually swallows nearly everyone connected to him. Visual style and cinematography. Part of what sets out for Justice apart from other action films of its time is its visual identity. Though it's mostly remembered for brutal fights and strong performances, the cinematography does just as much to build atmosphere. Flynn deliberately avoided the glossy, exaggerated look many action films were starting to adopt in the early 90s. Instead, he and cinematographer Rick Waite built a world that feels grounded and real, reinforcing the sense that this is happening in an actual Brooklyn neighborhood whose ordinary lives have been upended by extraordinary violence. Waite was already a seasoned cinematographer, having worked on films like National Lampoon's Vacation and Red Dawn, and he knew how to make real locations feel cinematic without sacrificing authenticity. Rather than dressing Brooklyn up, he shot it almost documentary style, letting its natural textures, aging buildings, crowded sidewalks, working-class gritty become part of the storytelling. From the opening scenes, the film has a clearly urban character. There are no glossy skylines or postcard shots of New York. The camera stays on neighborhood streets, apartment buildings, corner stores, bars, and churches. That choice builds a strong sense of place. Brooklyn isn't just a backdrop, it's practically a participant in the story, since every location carries the history of the two men who grew up there. The color palette reinforces that realism, too. Rather than saturated colors or heavy stylization, the film leans on muted earth tones and natural lighting. Browns, grays, dark greens, faded brick reds that mirror the emotional tone of a story about ordinary people confronting violence in familiar surroundings. Lighting follows the same logic, relying heavily on natural or naturalistic setups, soft daylight for daytime scenes, streetlights and neon for night, with shadows allowed to dominate much of the frame. That creates a sense of unpredictability, where danger could emerge from any dark corner, while avoiding the exaggerated color grading common in a lot of modern action movies. There's narrative intent behind the day-night contrast. Bobby's murder happens in broad daylight, which makes it more shocking, while later confrontations shift increasingly into darkness as Richie's behavior grows more unhinged. Camera placement is another strength. Flynn favors compositions that keep the geography of a scene clear, often opening with medium or wide shots before moving in on individual characters, so the audience always understands where people are in a space. A choice that pays off during action sequences, where spatial clarity makes every movement feel believable. Unlike many contemporary action films built on rapid editing and shaky cameras, this one often holds steady through conversations, using simple shot-reverse shot setups that let the performances carry the scene. The fight scenes especially benefit from this restraint, since Seagal's Aikido techniques rely on balance and efficiency rather than acrobatics. Flynn and Waite avoid excessive cutting so viewers can actually see his full movements. Wrist locks, throws, and disarms play out largely uninterrupted rather than being chopped up into quick edits, which gives the fights real credibility. Camera angles during these scenes generally stay at eye level, putting the audience inside the action rather than exaggerating it through extreme perspectives. Music and sound design. One of the more underrated aspects of Out for Justice is how it uses music and sound to shape the viewing experience. Unlike many action films of the period that leaned on loud orchestral themes or driving rock songs, this one takes a far more restrained route. Flynn understood the film's grounded tone would benefit from subtlety rather than non-stop audio stimulation, so the score and sound design work together to build tension and mood without overpowering the performances or story. Composer David Michael Frank, who already had a solid reputation across film and television, wrote music that supports the drama without dominating it, emphasizing atmosphere over big, memorable melodies, rather than a heroic theme constantly reminding the audience of Gino's strength. Frank wrote music that reflects the story's emotional uncertainty. The score rarely calls attention to itself, it quietly supports the narrative so audiences stay immersed in the world instead of noticing the music itself, which complements Flynn's realistic directing style perfectly. From the start, the score sets a serious, somber tone and no triumphant fanfares, just darker harmonies that hint something tragic is coming. After Bobby's murder, the music becomes one of the film's most effective emotional tools, using quiet orchestral passages to convey grief and determination without manipulating the audience through sentimentality. Much of Gino's emotional state comes through Seagal's performance, with the score simply reinforcing it. Long stretches of the investigation go without music at all, a choice that reflects real confidence from both director and composer, since silence often builds more tension than constant scoring, especially in a crime story. Letting conversations, footsteps, and neighborhood ambience carry certain scenes makes the world feel more authentic and unpredictable. When the score does return, it usually serves a specific purpose, like subtle rhythmic patterns that build suspense during investigative scenes without pulling focus from the dialogue. Frank also favors smaller instrumental combinations over big symphonic arrangements. Low strings, muted brass, synth textures, and light percussion create constant pressure without tipping into melodrama, matching the story's intimate, single neighborhood scale. Unlike a lot of contemporaries, the film rarely uses fast-paced musical cues to energize its fight scenes. Several major confrontations rely almost entirely on natural sound instead, which makes them feel more real. During hand-to-hand combat, the soundtrack is largely bodies hitting walls, punches landing, and furniture breaking. Sounds that carry the scene because there's little musical distraction, making every movement feel immediate. Seagal's fighting style benefits enormously from this approach, since his Aikido technique emphasizes precision over spectacle. Letting the audience hear each impact clearly reinforces just how effective it looks. Every wrist lock has an audible snap, every throw a convincing thud, communicating power without needing exaggerated visual effects. The sound team clearly put real care into these physical details. Punches sound heavy and solid, wood splinters convincingly, glass shatters sharply, and the gunfire carries real weight, all without leaning on stylized or exaggerated effects. That realism is part of why Bobby's murder lands so hard. Each shot echoes through the neighborhood, interrupting ordinary life with sudden, terrifying violence. Critical and commercial reception when Out for Justice arrived in 1991, it entered an extremely competitive stretch for action cinema, filled with established stars and audiences who'd come to expect bigger explosions and more elaborate set pieces every year. With 3 straight hits behind him, Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Marked for Death, expectations for Seagal's 4th lead role were high. While it wasn't the year's biggest earner, the film performed well, solidified Seagal's standing as a top action star, and built a lasting reputation through home video and cable reruns. Critics, though, were more divided. Audiences generally responded more warmly than critics did at the time, a pattern that would follow much of Seagal's early career. Fans came in expecting solid action, memorable fights, and a charismatic hero rather than heavy drama, and Out for Justice delivered exactly that, satisfying viewers who liked his distinct fighting style and cool screen presence. It did solid business at the box office relative to its modest budget, confirming Seagal's standing as one of Warner Brothers' most dependable action stars of the early 90s. 4 consecutive hits proved audiences were fully on board with his particular brand of action filmmaking, even as the genre kept getting more crowded. Commercially, the film helped cement Seagal's brand. Audiences knew exactly what to expect: a disciplined hero, efficient martial arts, gritty urban settings, and relentless pursuit of justice. And that consistency became one of the biggest strengths of the first half of his career. Critics were more split. Plenty acknowledged the film did exactly what it set out to do, but questioned how original it really was, with some calling the plot familiar. Revenge stories built around a murdered partner or friend were already common by the early 90s, and pointing to a lot of recognizable genre elements: the unstoppable detective, the unstable criminal, the tight-knit neighborhood, the inevitable showdown. Critics looking for something more innovative sometimes found it too conventional. Even so, several aspects consistently earned praise. William Forsythe's Richie Madano stood out as one of the most universally admired parts of the film, and many reviewers considered him the film's greatest asset, noting how his unpredictable performance elevated what could have been a routine villain, making Richie simultaneously frightening and strangely magnetic. Several critics even suggested Forsythe nearly stole the movie outright, his explosive energy contrasting sharply with Seagal's restraint to create one of the film's most compelling dynamics. Seagal himself got more mixed reviews. Supporters praised his physical presence, martial arts ability, and understated confidence, appreciating that he projected authority without leaning on exaggerated emotion, a trait that set him apart from louder action heroes. Others criticized his limited range, arguing his restrained expressions during dramatic beats kept audiences at arm's length, a critique that followed him throughout his early career. Even skeptics, though, generally credited the effectiveness of his physical performances. His real Aikido background gave his fight scenes a credibility that stunt doubles and clever editing couldn't fake. The action itself drew a lot of praise. Reviewers liked the film's grounded approach instead of impossible acrobatics. The fights feel efficient and brutally effective, every movement built to end a fight quickly rather than show off, which set the film apart from productions leaning into bigger explosions and more exaggerated stunts. Critics also praised the authenticity of the Brooklyn setting, noting that the extensive location shooting gave it a realism a lot of studio-bound productions lacked, portraying a believable working-class neighborhood with its own history and relationships. Flynn's direction earned praise too, while understated. His ability to maintain momentum while keeping performances front and center stood out, even if some critics wished for more visual experimentation. Legacy. More than 3 decades on, Out for Justice holds a unique place in action movie history. It was never meant to spawn sequels or become a blockbuster franchise. Instead, it earned its staying power through strong performances, practical filmmaking, and grounded storytelling. Over time, that combination built it a loyal following that has only grown since its theatrical run. Today it's widely considered one of the defining films of Seagal's early career and one of the standout urban action thrillers of the early 90s. Perhaps its biggest legacy is helping establish Seagal as a serious, lasting action star rather than a passing trend. Above the Law introduced him and Hard to Kill confirmed his popularity, but Out for Justice proved his appeal had staying power, delivering another hit with a clearly distinct identity built on martial arts, police drama, and understated screen presence. At a time when the genre was packed with giants, Schwarzenegger's larger-than-life spectacle, Stallone's gritty determination, Willis's reluctant hero charm, Van Damme's acrobatics, Seagal carved out a completely different lane, calm, disciplined, precise, and never reliant on one-liners or impossible stunts. Out for Justice cemented that identity more clearly than almost anything else in his early filmography, and many fans still consider Gino Felino one of his best roles, a character grounded in friendship and grief rather than abstract heroism, which makes him one of the more relatable protagonists in Seagal's body of work. The film also helped define what fans now call Seagal's golden period, typically covering Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, Out for Justice, and Under Siege, films marked by practical action, believable combat, grounded stories, and memorable villains. Many longtime fans consider this stretch the peak of his career, before bigger budgets and shifting audience expectations changed the style of his later films. As a result, Out for Justice remains a frequently recommended entry point for anyone discovering his work. Forsythe's Richie Madano left a lasting mark on the genre, too. While plenty of action villains are remembered for elaborate schemes or overwhelming power, Richie endures because of pure psychological unpredictability. His influence shows up in later crime thrillers that favor unstable, emotionally volatile antagonists over calculating masterminds. He's frightening because he can't control himself, and that unpredictability still resonates with fans decades later. The film also helped broaden how martial arts were presented in mainstream American action cinema. Before Seagal, audiences mostly associated the genre with flashy kicks and acrobatics. His Aikido-based technique, leverage, balance, joint manipulation, efficiency offered something different, and Out for Justice contains some of the clearest demonstrations of that philosophy. with Gino frequently ending fights in seconds through precise throws and locks rather than long exchanges. While few later action stars adopted Aikido as their signature style, the film expanded public awareness of martial arts beyond karate, kung fu, and taekwondo, proving effective combat could look controlled and technical rather than purely athletic. Its commitment to practical filmmaking is another part of its legacy. Modern audiences increasingly appreciate films made before CGI became the default. Out for Justice relies almost entirely on real stunts, physical performances, and location shooting, with every explosion, car collision, and shattered window created on set rather than generated digitally. As conversations around practical versus digital effects have grown over the past couple of decades, the film has picked up renewed appreciation, with younger viewers often commenting on how tangible the action feels compared to many modern productions. How audiences have responded over time. One of the more interesting aspects of Out for Justice is how differently generations of viewers have read it. Released in 1991 as a straightforward action thriller, it's been revisited with fresh eyes as both cinema and society have evolved. What many originally saw as just another Seagal vehicle has gradually come to be appreciated as a snapshot of a specific era in filmmaking and urban American life. Attitudes toward its violence, heroism, and policing have shifted with the times, but one thing has stayed constant: audiences keep finding it entertaining because of its authenticity, memorable characters, and grounded approach to action. For viewers who saw it during its original run, the film delivered exactly what action fans wanted at the time, an era before superhero movies and CGI took over, when audiences expected practical stunts, physical combat, and a villain who felt like a genuine threat. Many connected immediately with Gino because he wasn't some distant superhero. He lived in the neighborhood he policed, personally knew both victims and criminals, and his motivations felt real because they came from friendship rather than abstract duty. Bobby's murder became the emotional anchor for a lot of viewers, giving the story clear stakes and someone to grieve alongside before the action even kicked into gear. The neighborhood itself struck a chord, too. Viewers from big cities recognized the kind of close-knit community the film portrays, where families have known each other for generations, a world that felt worth protecting even as violence threatened to tear it apart. And of course, audiences responded strongly to Forsythe's performance. While most rooted for Gino, plenty of people left theaters talking mainly about the villain, since Richie felt disturbingly believable rather than a typical movie criminal, capable of exploding into violence for almost no reason. That unpredictability made a lot of viewers genuinely uneasy, and decades later, he's still remembered as one of the era's most memorable villains precisely because he feels psychologically real rather than exaggerated. Reactions to Seagal himself varied depending on what audiences wanted. Fans loved his calm confidence and efficient fighting style, appreciating how focused he stayed under pressure. Others, more used to Willis's humor or Stallone's intensity, found his restraint a bit too reserved, though even skeptics of his acting usually credited the effectiveness of his physical performances. Home video played a huge role in how the film's reputation evolved. Throughout the 90s, countless fans discovered it through VHS rentals rather than theaters, and repeated home viewings let audiences catch details they'd missed the first time. The authenticity of the setting, the strength of Forsythe's performance, Flynn's restrained direction. Conversations began focusing less exclusively on the fight scenes and more on atmosphere, dialogue, and character relationships. Cable television extended its reach even further, turning it into a regular fixture on action-oriented channels throughout the 90s and early 2000s and introducing it to a whole new generation. Interestingly, younger viewers tended to approach it differently than the original 1991 audience. Rather than comparing it to its contemporaries, they saw it as a classic representing an earlier style of filmmaking, where the practical effects, authentic locations, and slower pacing read as strengths rather than expectations. The character's part of why Out for Justice still resonates more than 30 years later is that its characters feel like real people rather than action movie archetypes. Though it's remembered mostly for its fights, the emotional core comes from the relationships and personal arcs of its characters. Flynn clearly understood that action only lands when the audience actually cares about the people involved, so every major character serves a purpose tied to the film's larger themes of loyalty, justice, and the cost of unchecked violence. Some characters change dramatically over the course of the story, others stay largely the same, but every arc reinforces the central conflict between order and chaos. At the center is Gino Felino. Unlike a lot of action heroes who start out isolated with little connection to the people around them, Gino is deeply rooted in his community from the very first scene, not just a cop assigned to a random homicide, but a lifelong resident who grew up alongside the people he protects. That grounding sets him apart from typical action protagonists. His identity comes from relationships rather than professional achievements, and he knows the streets, the families, and the social dynamics of his neighborhood inside and out. That's exactly why Bobby's murder hits him not just as an investigator but as someone who's lost a piece of his own past. Gino already has a strong moral compass at the start of the film. He's disciplined, confident, and well respected, so unlike heroes who need to discover courage along the way, his arc isn't about becoming someone different. It's about testing the values he already holds under enormous emotional pressure. Bobby's death is the defining emotional event of that arc. More than a colleague, Bobby represents childhood memories and irreplaceable history, and the audience understands the depth of that loss. As the investigation wears on, Gino faces mounting emotional strain from grieving families and frightened witnesses, yet he consistently refuses to let anger override his judgment. That restraint becomes one of his defining traits. Several small moments throughout hint at his internal conflict. Seagal's performance stays deliberately understated, but careful viewers will notice subtle shifts in expression, tone, and posture that communicate grief and determination without any big speeches. By the final confrontation, Gino has been tested repeatedly, both physically and emotionally, having witnessed the damage Richie leaves behind, yet he never abandons his sense of responsibility. His eventual victory means more than just beating a criminal. It confirms that discipline and loyalty are stronger than hatred and revenge. Unlike heroes who grow more violent as their stories progress, Gino ends the film essentially unchanged. It's the world around him that shifts, not his character. That kind of arc, sometimes called a flat arc, lets a steady protagonist reshape the people and circumstances around him rather than undergoing his own transformation. Standing opposite him is Forsythe's Richie Madano, whose arc runs in the exact opposite direction. Where Gino represents emotional discipline, Richie represents total psychological collapse. Interestingly, he doesn't start the film as a balanced person slowly losing his grip. His opening murder of Bobby immediately establishes that he's crossed a line there's no coming back from, and his instability only deepens as the story goes on. Costume and production design. One of the film's most overlooked strengths is the careful work put into its costumes and production design. Unlike fantasy or historical epics built on elaborate visual invention, Out for Justice succeeds by making everything feel completely ordinary. Every jacket, apartment, and street corner sells the illusion that we're watching real life play out in Brooklyn rather than actors on a constructed set. Flynn understood authenticity would be one of the film's biggest assets, and the costume, production, and location teams worked together to build an environment that feels believable from beginning to end. Set almost entirely in working-class Brooklyn, the visual design reflects that reality immediately. Nothing feels glamorous or overly polished. Buildings show real wear, sidewalks look worn down from decades of foot traffic, and the businesses look like they've served the same families for generations. Rather than idealizing New York, the filmmakers lean into its imperfections, and those details establish atmosphere before a single character even speaks. Filming largely took place on actual streets instead of built sets, a decision that lends a level of authenticity that's genuinely hard to fake. Brick apartment buildings, narrow residential blocks, family-run stores, and neighborhood bars all paint a convincing picture of everyday Brooklyn life in the early 90s. One of the strongest design choices is how connected each location feels to the people who use it. Apartments filled with personal belongings suggesting years of family history, restaurants decorated the way regulars would expect, bars that feel worn in rather than staged. These environmental details communicate class, background, and personal history without a word of dialogue. Gino's wardrobe reflects exactly who he is, rather than the stylized costumes many action heroes wear to look larger than life. He dresses like an actual street detective. Leather jackets, jeans, casual shirts, practical boots. That leather jacket became one of Seagal's visual trademarks during this stretch of his career. But here it never reads as a superhero costume. It's practical and reflects his working class roots, appearing worn rather than expensive. That understated wardrobe says a lot about him without a word. Confidence without vanity, professionalism without stiffness, physical readiness without looking militaristic. He barely changes outfits throughout the investigation, reinforcing the sense of a relentless, uninterrupted search. And because his jackets and shirts are loose-fitting, they leave room for his Aikido movements to read clearly on screen. Form and function working together. Richie's wardrobe stands in sharp contrast, reflecting both his personality and his unraveling mental state. His clothes are a touch more flamboyant than Gino's while still feeling grounded in the neighborhood, projecting a confidence that starts to look more disordered as the story progresses. Subtle shifts that make him look less controlled and more disheveled as the pressure builds. Where Gino's style is calm and practical, Richie's is louder and more aggressive, reinforcing their opposing personalities without a word of explanation. Supporting characters get the same careful attention. Period-appropriate police uniforms without unnecessary flash, slightly more casual but still professional detectives, and criminals dressed according to their status rather than exaggerated gangster cliché. Copyright S. Ordinary neighborhood residents, shop owners, bartenders, churchgoers. They are dressed naturally, with nothing theatrical or overly coordinated, which strengthens the documentary-like feel throughout. The wardrobe also captures early 90s fashion without drawing attention to itself. Denim and leather jackets, patterned shirts, sneakers and boots. Choices timeless enough that the film has aged more gracefully than productions that leaned harder into passing trends. Set decoration carries the same weight. Every interior feels lived in, filled with photographs, religious items, and personal collections built up over years rather than props placed for the camera. Screenplay and dialogue. While Out for Justice is best known for its hard-hitting action, its screenplay deserves more credit than it usually gets. Written by David Lee Henry during a period when action films were getting increasingly larger than life, the script deliberately avoids unnecessary complexity and no sprawling conspiracies, no constant exposition, no endless one-liners. Instead, it focuses on believable conversations between people who've known each other most of their lives, understanding that its real strength lies in character and atmosphere rather than plot mechanics. Nearly every exchange either moves the investigation forward, deepens a relationship, builds out the neighborhood, or ratchets up tension. The writing is economical. Very little dialogue exists just to fill time. Unlike a lot of modern action films that over-explain everything, this one trusts the audience to read situations through observation rather than exposition, which gives conversations a naturalistic rhythm closer to how people actually talk. One of the script's real achievements is how it establishes the characters' shared history without ever spelling it out. Gino, Bobby, and Richie have known each other since childhood, and that comes through in offhand references to old memories and neighborhood traditions rather than forced backstory dumps, making the world feel like it's been unfolding for decades before the story even starts. Gino's dialogue mirrors his personality, direct, calm, and purposeful, without wasted words, which fits Seagal's acting style perfectly. Rather than expressing emotion through long speeches, he communicates through action and small shifts in tone, and his quiet confidence never needs to be announced because his reputation already precedes him in the neighborhood. Richie's dialogue is the opposite, impulsive and unstable, swinging unpredictably between humor, friendliness, and sudden threat. That unpredictability is one of the script's best tools for building suspense, since a simple conversation can turn dangerous without warning, and Forsythe's delivery makes even ordinary lines feel unsettling. His words rarely reflect any long-term thinking, they mirror whatever he's feeling in the moment, reinforcing just how dangerous he really is. The script also leans into authentic neighborhood language, giving each character, cops, criminals, family, business owners, a distinct speech pattern that reflects their background, which strengthens the film's overall realism. Overlapping conversations and references to people who never appear on screen create the illusion of a much bigger social world beyond the story itself. And despite being a serious crime thriller at heart, the film finds room for dry, understated humor that arises naturally from character rather than traditional jokes, giving the audience brief relief from the tension without undercutting the film's overall seriousness. Marketing and release. Film marketing in 1991 looked nothing like it does today, and no social media, no viral trailers, none of the constant digital back and forth between studios and audiences. Instead, campaigns relied on theatrical trailers, TV ads, radio spots, print coverage, billboards, and the fast-growing home video market. Warner Brothers knew Seagal had become one of its most valuable stars, and the campaign for Out for Justice leaned almost entirely on that reputation rather than selling audiences on plot details. The pitch was simple. Seagal was back with another intense action film. By this point, thanks to Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Marked for Death, audiences already knew exactly what to expect from a Seagal picture, so his name alone did a lot of the marketing's heavy lifting. TV spots and trailers highlighted his calm confidence, brutal fighting style, and relentless drive, leaning fully into what fans already wanted rather than over-explaining the story. Even the title did promotional work on its own. Out for Justice communicates the film's central theme without giving away plot details, suggesting determination and moral purpose while staying broad enough to appeal widely. It fits right alongside other short, punchy action titles of the era, like Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Total Recall, and Under Siege. The poster was one of the campaign's strongest assets, putting Seagal front and center with a serious expression, confident stance, and a weapon that reinforced the image built by his earlier films. The design stayed simple rather than cluttering the frame with explosions or supporting characters, and the dark, muted color palette signaled a gritty crime thriller rather than a lighter action comedy, matching the tone of the film itself. The bold, straightforward typography echoed that same seriousness. The trailer followed the same philosophy, focused on generating excitement through carefully chosen scenes rather than spoiling major plot points. Bobby's murder established the emotional stakes quickly, while brief glimpses of Richie's volatile behavior hinted at the danger ahead, and editors balanced story beats with fight scenes, gunfire, and chases without giving away the ending, a typical restraint for trailers of that period. The music leaned into urgency and suspense through dramatic orchestral cues and quick editing, without relying on pop songs or heavy narration the way a lot of modern trailers do. TV advertising was another major piece of the push, with 30-second spots running heavily during sports broadcasts and prime time. Given the limited runtime, these ads focused almost entirely on Seagal, Forsythe's menacing villain, and the film's action, emphasizing the physical combat that had become one of Seagal's biggest selling points. Audiences saw wrist locks, throws, and rapid takedowns unlike anything in a Schwarzenegger or Stallone film, and Warner Brothers highlighted that distinctive style whenever it could. Print coverage rounded out the campaign, with magazines and newspapers regularly interviewing Seagal about his martial arts background and rising Hollywood profile. A coverage that reinforced the authenticity of his on-screen skills, since unlike actors who simply learn choreography for a role, Seagal brought decades of genuine training to the screen. Flynn also did his share of press, discussing his approach to realistic crime drama and his collaboration with Seagal, which helped reassure audiences that the film would prioritize authenticity over spectacle. How it compares to Seagal's other films. Out for Justice sits at an interesting crossroads within the action genre, a part classic revenge thriller, part grounded police drama built round community and personal responsibility. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries, it skips the global conspiracies and military set pieces, staying rooted in one neighborhood and letting its characters carry the story's emotional weight. Comparing it to Seagal's other work and to the broader action landscape of the time helps explain why it's remained one of the most respected films of his early career. The most obvious comparison is to Seagal's own earlier work. Above the Law, 1988, introduced audiences to his screen persona through Nika Toscani, a former intelligence operative turned Chicago cop investigating political corruption. That film established a lot of what would become his trademarks: the calm demeanor, the Aikido-based fighting, but its focus stayed on larger government conspiracies and international intrigue. Out for Justice feels far more personal by comparison. Gino isn't up against corrupt institutions, just the fallout of a friend's murder playing out on the streets where he grew up, which gives the story a level of emotional intimacy Above the Law never quite reaches, while keeping the same grounded approach to action. Hard to Kill, 1990, shares thematic ground, too. Both films feature cops driven by personal tragedy pursuing powerful enemies. But Hard to Kill follows a more traditional revenge structure, with its hero surviving an assassination attempt and returning years later for payback. Out for Justice keeps the emotional focus immediate. Bobby's murder happens right at the start, and Gino has to act while the grief is still raw, which gives the story real urgency and momentum. Marked for Death, 1990, offers another useful comparison. Like Out for Justice, it follows a determined lawman protecting his community from dangerous criminals, but it leans into mysticism and international crime that push it toward bigger, more exaggerated territory. Out for Justice stays noticeably more grounded. Richie is frightening because he's believable, not because he has supernatural backing or a criminal empire. His menace comes entirely from psychological instability rather than outside power. Many longtime fans consider Out for Justice the most balanced entry in Seagal's early filmography. It combines the investigative grounding of Above the Law, the emotional drive of Hard to Kill, and the intensity of Marked for Death, while dialing back some of the more exaggerated elements those films leaned on. The comparison to Under Siege, released the following year, is especially telling. That film became Seagal's biggest commercial hit and introduced him to a much wider international audience, with a far bigger budget, elaborate set pieces, a stacked supporting cast, and a much bigger premise built around the hijacking of a U.S. battleship.